Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar for standards drafters. Today we will speak about the Internal Regulations Part 3 and more in particular about the updates to the latest edition. So please bear in mind that you're all muted as usual during the presentation. So I advise you, or I ask you to enter your questions in the Q&A panel of the webinar. After the presentation, we will have a look at the questions, and if there is still time left, we will answer your questions. In any case, all questions and answers will be uploaded together on the website as well, and you will be informed when that is available for you. You will also receive later today the PowerPoint presentation in your inbox that you can have a look and click on the links if you want to. Should you be on Twitter, you can also, of course, tweet about this topic and share the information via our @standards4EU handle. So let me present you the speakers of today. My two colleagues, Amy Jane and Alicia, are going to present you about the new updates for the Internal Regulations Part 3. They're both project managers, one in Energy and Living and the other one in Manufacturing of the Standardization and Digital Solutions Department here at the CEN-CENELEC Management Center. So ladies, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. As Els has already said, we'll be discussing the updates to the Internal Regulations Part 3. But as we have an hour today, we'd also like to discuss and review the Annex A checklist, which is found at the end of the Internal Regulations Part 3. And then just cover some general drafting tips, just to jog your memory a little bit on what you need to do. So first of all, we've got Leah with the Internal Regulations Part 3.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see here, we have the cover of the Internal Regulations Part 3 that was recently published. This is based on the ISO IEC Directives Part 2 from 2018. This version of the IR Part 3 was published in June 2019 and is currently available on the CEN-BOSS under reference material. So the changes that we go through today will apply to all drafts that are received as from the 1st of October. Okay, as usual in European deliverables, there is a list of the main changes from the previous version in the European forward. We will go through these changes today, and I will provide some print screens to show where they occur in the text. And as we go through, I think you'll see that the changes and the updates are a lot less extensive than the previous revision where the entire text was reformatted. But a lot of changes were made, subtle changes to improve consistency with other parts of the text, to add some clarity or more information, and in some cases to provide further or better examples. Some of the changes I won't go through in detail because they are more general, such as the updating of reference documents and cross-references in the text. The grammar and linguistic consistency was reviewed and some changes were made. And lastly, a terminological entry was added for publicly available specification, which does not apply directly to CEN and CENELEC, but is for ISO or IEC. So we've added it here as well. So one of the first changes on the list I'll go through here is in Clause 7, the verbal forms for expressions of provisions. Here in tables 3 to 7, the phrase verbal form has simply been replaced with preferred verbal form. For clarification, perhaps, that equivalent phrases or expressions can be used in certain cases. In addition, here in table 3, the phrase needs to and need not have been deleted as equivalent expressions for shall and shall not. So meaning these are no longer considered as required phrases, needs to or need not. In table 5, discussing the forms for permissions, the phrase need not has been replaced with may not as an expression of permission in the negative form in table 5. This is not the same as a prohibition, in which case we should always use shall not. Here in 8.1 language versions, this is simply a clarification that has been added. It's information that the general policy on languages is explained in the ISO IEC Directives Part 1. So here in Clause 15, some text describing how normative references are cited has been redrafted in the clauses listed. This was done to improve clarity of meaning, but also to align the text with the introductory paragraph in clause 2, which was updated during the last revision. So as you can read here, for example, it states that the references clause lists documents which are cited in the text in such a way that some or all of their content constitutes requirements of the document. This was to add some clarification, where in some cases it was just written, considerably written normative. And in addition, this change was made in 5.15.3. But also the example 1 was redrafted. So here we give an example of a citation that uses the word should. Wiring of these connectors should take into account the wire and cable diameter of the cables defined in IEC 61156, for example. So it's been clarified to state that citations using should do not express a requirement. So these documents cited are not normative, but should instead be listed in the bibliography instead of in clause 2. And in addition, it already stated that we should avoid using potentially ambiguous expressions when making citations to documents, but it added a little bit more information saying when it's that, for example, the expression see and refer to should only be used informatively. So in the example 2, for additional information on communication, see ISO 14063. This is an example of an informative reference. So I think also the intention here is to avoid ambiguous expressions to make it clear. And this is important too for CCMC editors, because we need to go through the text and check how references are referred to and check whether they really belong in clause 2 or the bibliography. So the more that you follow the rules and verbal forms that are outlined in table 3, the easier it is too for us and also for the user to see whether a document is truly normative or informative. So we urge you to use table 3 as often as possible. Okay, so here, and this is in clause 10.2, permitted reference documents. And this section is about documents that are listed in clause 2, but that are not ISO, IEC, or CEN-CENELEC documents for which you would normally need a TC decision. An extra bullet point has been added at the end that any patented item required for the implementation of the ISO or IEC or CEN-CENELEC deliverable in the reference document has to be available to be licensed in accordance with ISO IEC directives part 1. So actually in our case for CEN-CENELEC, this would be referring to guide 8, the guidelines for implementation of the common policy on patents. So basically if a patent has been identified in a reference document, then it must be licensed under the specific policy. And the policy is the same for ISO IEC. The explanatory guidelines are different, so refer to guide 8. In clauses 14 and 15 on numbering, a statement has simply been added in clause 14 that the scope shall be numbered as clause 1, which is something that's typically done. Inclusion of a statement in clause 15 as well, that the normative references clause shall be numbered as clause 2, to make that clear, and that it shall only appear once in a document. There should not be other references and annexes, etc., that list normative or required references. A similar statement has been added in clause 16 for terms and definitions, that this shall be numbered always as clause 3. It may be subdivided as well, and that it shall only appear once in a document. Same thing, no terms and definitions listed in an annex, for example, or another clause. Also in relation to clause 16, a statement that terms shall be presented in their basic grammatical form, that is nouns in the singular, verbs in the infinitive. This was a clarification. And more importantly, that a definition shall not take the form of or contain a requirement. This is something that was in the previous version of the IR3 that we follow, but was left out in the latest revision. So now it's been added back in. The next change in the list was related to annexes. This was also a clarification. In the last paragraph, you'll see that informative annexes may contain optional requirements. For example, a test method that is optional may contain requirements, but there is no need to comply with these requirements to claim compliance with the document. This was something that had needed to be clarified. Basically, as informative annexes are optional, they continue to be optional, but there may be requirements in the annex that would need to be followed in order to follow the rules of the annex, but not to claim compliance with the document. In 21.4, a statement has been added that the bibliography shall not have a clause number. And former clause 34 has been split into clauses 34 and 35. Clarification has been added on where to find additional rules on management standards and management system standards. Information. The next change is in 28.5.3 on key and labels to figures. And this is the addition of a new figure 6, which shows an example of a graph. You'll see here. Some of the figure was improved, but also some of the text was redrafted to make clear that labeling of curves and lines shall be replaced always by key references without having text in the graph. But also that the labeling on the axis shall not be replaced by numerical key references, which can be confused by the numbering, but which with numeric values, but rather with, for example, letters, which was shown in this case. So this was just an extra example. And also under types of figures, revision of figure 7. This was formerly figure 6, but some more detail has been added to the example of a mechanical engineering drawing. And one of the last changes in the list was the addition of table 8 in clause 24 on notes. This table summarizes how to use notes and footnotes within documents. It's actually very useful. It doesn't add any new rules to the document. As you can see in column 3, it has a cross-reference to the clause in IR3 that describes the rule more in detail and in depth, but it's easy because notes are, depending on where they appear in the text, whether it's in a figure or a table, in clause 3, they have different rules. And this way, everything is sort of combined in one table, so you can see quickly the different rules for numbering, designation, and provisions, for example. So I think this was a useful addition for reference. Okay, so those are just some of the main changes that were listed in the European Forward. There have been other small editorial changes throughout the text, but these are the most important.
Yeah, so now we'll move on to a review of the Annex A checklist. We did do a more in-depth webinar on this a few months back. However, it's always a good idea just to go back over things and refresh our memory a little bit. So the Annex A basically contains a checklist of all of the drafting points that you might need to know when you start drafting a standard, but they're also really invaluable for while you are drafting an existing standard. It's basically just a list of all the parts that you really need to include, but also include some optional parts. Looks a little bit like this, so it's fairly user-friendly. You can print it and check things off as you do them. And the good thing about it is that it follows the structure of a CEN and CENELEC deliverable while mentioning drafting aspects to be checked. So whether you're drafting for CEN or CENELEC, you can use this. It's invaluable. We highly recommend it. Aside from this, a very good starting place for you is the simplified templates. Now we have one for CEN and one for CENELEC, and they're found on the CEN and CENELEC BOSS sites separately. Again, a really invaluable tool. You download a zip file. It contains a Word document that is fully styled. All you really have to do is just input your information in there. It makes our lives easier as editors because everything's already styled. So at the minute we have quite a focus on preparing XML drafts, which is quite difficult when nothing is styled in the text. Obviously, we appreciate it's difficult if you don't have any experience with this. But the simple templates are really good places to start. So then the first point of the checklist is the European Forward. This is a mandatory element. You need to have it. If it's not present in the document, the editor will add it. If you are revising a standard, you need to include the superseding information and a list of any technical changes between this draft and the previous draft. Even if it's super small, super simple changes, just make a quick list of them. No requirements, permissions, or recommendations, please. We will remove them. onto the introduction is an optional element. It should be purely informative. It should describe the content. It should explain a little bit on why the standard is needed. No requirements, however, you can have recommendations and permissions. We don't recommend that you put those in though, just try and keep it a statement of fact as you can. However, if you have any patent rights, you do need to have the introduction. That said, if you do have patent rights, we will remove the patent rights sentence from the forward, so you don't need that duplicate information. Onto the scope. Again, it's a mandatory element. It should always be clause number 1. And it should just give a summary of the subject, the limits of applicability of the deliverable, so what it does cover, what it doesn't cover. Again, it should be written as a series of statements of facts. No requirements, permissions, or recommendations. We will absolutely remove those and let you know that we've done that. So try and keep that as simple as possible. Normative references. We're going to recap. It's a mandatory element. It says this is new in the IR Part 3 because I think many drafters still aren't really aware of this. But Clause 2 is mandatory, and we will insert it if it's not there. Even if it's empty, it has to act as a placeholder for if you want it. But I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. So you have an introductory paragraph. As Leah mentioned, this has been updated in the new IR3. It's everywhere now, so you can't really miss it. It lists the documents that are normatively cited in the text. And as I said, it needs to be mentioned even if it's empty. And this is just because when you start with inquiry, you might not have any normative references, but when you get to formal vote and you have something, it's a lot easier to put it in. You don't have to renumber all of your clauses. You don't need to renumber all of your cross-references. It's a lot less work. And if you have any references to non-international or European standards, we will need a TC decision, and it's better for you if you get this to us as soon as possible because it can block the publication of a standard. So that's anything that's non-ISO, non-IEC, and non-EN based. So what does normatively cited actually mean? The simplest way to describe it is to say something along the lines of connectors shall conform to the characteristics specified in EN blah blah. If you use should or may or can, anything else, it's not normative. It's informative. So that's usually a good way to make something normative is just to use shall. And it sounds stupid, but make sure they're actually cited normatively in the text. We do check this pretty stringently. We do go through everything, make sure everything is normative. If it's not, we'll put it in the bibliography and we will let you know. And if you want some more ways of expressing requirements, if shall doesn't really fit, then you can take a look at Table 3 in the Internal Regulations Part 3.
Okay, now moving on to dating of normative references. When should my reference be dated? So if there is a reference to a specific section of the standard, such as a subclause, a figure, a table, then the reference has to be dated for the IR3. The example below is a perfect example. They're referring to clause 8.4. At this time, I also want to point out that this is a preferred way to reference for us as editors too, to reference a clause in the standard, EN 1780, 8.4, for example, rather than saying clause 8.4 of EN 1780. The reason for this has to do with XML and the XML tagging and the tool that we use. So if you are referencing, please follow this example. It's much appreciated. It saves us a lot of time. If there is a reference to an entire document, then in these cases, the text does not have to be dated. If you are adding a date, you have to refer to the latest edition. And remember that, yes, of course, if it's dated in the text, it should be dated in Clause 2. Clause 2, the list in Clause 2 should always reflect what is written in the main text. We should, of course, be referencing published documents, active and available ENs. In some cases, it is acceptable to reference draft ENs, PRENs, because these are publicly available. It's not ideal, but can be acceptable. But we cannot have references to formal vote drafts, withdrawn standards, abandoned work items in the pipeline, items that aren't yet, the work hasn't yet begun, or closed standards. References have to be fully active, available, and up to date. One specific rule to keep in mind is that we cannot accept normative references to EU regulations, directives, or legal texts. These will be either changed out directly by us, as shown in some of the examples below, or otherwise we will come back to the TC Secretary to ask that the text be revised or redrafted, and that none of these documents, regulations, for example, be listed in Clause 2. We will move them to the bibliography, and it will have to be reworded. That's very important to note, because it happens a lot. It's good to keep in mind. The next part that we'll go through is terms and definitions. Basically, so the terms and definitions clause, of course, will provide definitions for terms that are used in the document to make it easier to understand them in the context of the document. This is also a mandatory element, and this was new in the last version of the IR Part 3, similar to the Clause 2 that Amy discussed, and it acts for the same reason. So you'll see here we have introductory text that has to be used, and this was also new in the IR Part 3, the last version. But if there are no terms and definitions, the clause needs to be included anyway, and simply written that no terms and definitions are listed in this document. So when we go through the checklist, the first thing that we come across are the terms listed used in the document, so please check that they are defined if need be. Do suitable terms exist in the terminology databases already? This is also important because they should be referenced as a source if it is already defined in another standard. And are the definitions correctly drafted? Of course, as we know from our previous section, that there are no requirements allowed in definitions. Definitions should be, for example, a single phrase. There should be no punctuation. They should be able to replace the term in the context of the document. These are all things that can be found in the clause on terms and definitions in the IR3. Okay, so you can check it in the list.
So now onto figures, which is another quite important aspect of drafting. As I mentioned earlier, XML is something that we have a quite strong focus on for the minute, and we find that figures often cause us quite a lot of problems. So aside from the drafting rules, how to use them, we also have some technical requirements that we need you to meet in order to create an XML file, basically. So in terms of drafting, figures are needed to present the information more clearly. It can often be a bit easier to present things in form of a figure. Now for CEN and CENELEC, we do have different rules, so the technical requirements are slightly different. For CEN, it's obligatory that you provide us with the figure files. For CENELEC, although it's not obligatory, it really, really helps your editor out massively. So these rules are obligatory for CEN only, but CENELEC, please take note. We need the figures to be in a separate folder as either .tiff, which is Adobe Photoshop, or .eps, which is Adobe Illustrator. The naming of the files, keep it as simple as possible. This just helps the editor to insert them in the right place. So for general figures in the text, you've got figure 001, 002, or fig 1, fig 2. Any subfigures 1A, 1B will suffice, or figure 1A, 1B. In annexes, start with the annex letter and then whichever number figure it is. In tables, table 1, 1 is okay. And the same thing for figures that are found in a key. So the number of the figure and then the number of the figure in the key, if that makes sense. They have to be language neutral, so try not to have text boxes in there that contain paragraphs of text. Try and keep it as simple as possible. And these are the technical requirements that we really, really need you to meet in order that we can create the XML file. That's a resolution of 600 dpi, LZW compression, and sizing 100%. That basically just means for the sizing, when you insert the figure, it has to be the size that you want it to be. So don't insert it, it's tiny, and then make it bigger. Make sure that it's the size you want it to be when you insert it. And figures have to be numbered continuously in the text starting at 1. So don't restart them for each clause. The first figure in the text is figure 1, the second is figure 2, and so on. If you have a key to a figure, draft it in a table. It just makes our life a little bit easier. It makes it easier to style as well. It's a bit easier laid out. So as I mentioned, for CEN, it's obligatory to provide all the figure files with the document at the time that you send it to us. If you don't send us your figures and you have them in the text, we will probably reject it. And again, for CENELEC, it's not obligatory, but it is massively, massively helpful. It saves us a lot of time if we already have the files. If we don't have the figure files, the quality may well be very poor, probably will be very poor. And we may have to contact the TC to provide us with the figures. This is not just the XML that will be poor quality, also the Word and PDF will be quite bad quality too. So please be aware of that. If your subfigures need a key, use one single key for all the subfigures combined. Don't have separate keys if this is not possible. If you do need separate keys, then the figures need to be separate as well. You can't have them as subfigures. And please don't provide figures to replace an entire table. We need the tables to be editable for the translators, but also it makes it a bit easier if you need to change any information between the inquiry and the formal vote stage. Goes without saying, really. So if we ask you for an editable table, please provide it to us, because it's quite a lot of work to rekey everything if we have to. And then just a little note there, pay attention to your figure quality. If you're not sure about anything, get in touch with us. We'd be more than happy to help. But you can check your quality yourself. You can use projects online to do this before you submit them. And as you can see from this little screenshot here on projects online, you have on the right-hand side, image quality check. I believe you just upload a zip file and it will take you through all of the steps. It's fairly user-friendly and it just gives you a bit of an idea of whether or not your text will be rejected on the basis of poor quality figures, or if we will accept it and proceed forward. It's a password protected application available for CEN and CENELEC members and TC secretaries. If you don't have access, there's an email address right there, projects@CEN-CENELEC.eu, so get in touch and we can help you.
Okay, now moving on to tables. Some of the basic things to look out for tables. Does it have a title in the first place? Is the title concise, simple, easy to understand? Have the tables been numbered correctly? All tables should be numbered, and one number per table, please. There are no subtables allowed. For example, table 1-1. Title should always appear at the top of the table as well. And cross-references. As is the case for figures, for tables, they should be cross-referenced or cited in the text. This is something that we have to look out for. So try to make sure that that is present in the document. It's also very useful for XML because it can be tagged in the text in the HTML version, having cross-references, besides being an IR3 rule. Something else very important for tables, and this is specifically important for XML, is that tables are drafted simply. So avoid as much as possible the frequent merging and unmerging or splitting of cells and diagonal lines, etc. The longer and more complex the table is, the harder it is for us to style and create XML, and it can sometimes lead to delays. So as much as possible, avoid splitting tables. If they are long, avoid splitting them and keep one single table, and just draft them as simply as is possible. Sometimes that might mean more than one simple table instead of one complex table. And please keep in mind that we cannot accept images as tables. All tables have to be drafted in Word. And of course, we know images shouldn't contain text, so this makes sense here. Another important thing has to do with nested tables. This also applies for XML, that we cannot process a document if it contains nested tables. XML cannot distinguish this, so we need to make sure in this case that perhaps you add an additional row or additional columns to avoid having these. It helps us out a lot if we can remove them ahead of time. Drafting tables simply, of course. Yes, one other option, of course, instead of diagonal text or vertical text, would be to have a table set to landscape, if it's possible to fit more information in. And another important note is to align text in the table using the aligners or perhaps the word justification tool, rather than using a lot of tab marks or spaces or paragraph marks, because XML also interprets tabs as a single space. So when you need to align text in a special way in a table, and we run it through the XML tool, a lot of this alignment and justification can be lost. So this is really important. It's also really important later on for members who are creating PDF from XML. This can cause a lot of issues if there are tabs and tables. So please keep this in mind. On to the annexes, as we discussed a bit earlier. One of the first things to keep in mind for an annex is whether it is normative or informative. This has to be labeled underneath the annex title. An annex has to be cited in the main text, and it has to be cited depending on whether it's labeled as informative or normative. So in these examples, as you can see, if you simply have a reference in parentheses, this reads to us in IR3 rules as an informative reference. If, for example, you say that a test method shall be done according to Annex B, this would be considered a normative reference. So please make this clear in the text for us and for the user, so we know if it's labeled correctly. Something that changed in the last version of the IR3 was that annexes no longer need to be ordered in the order they appear in the text. And for the bibliography, which of course is an informative element, is not required, but a bibliography should contain anything that is referenced informatively in the text. It can also contain background material that is used for the drafting of the document or referenced. It cannot contain normative references. One thing also to check is whether it is formatted consistently. For example, whether everything has a source number or not numbered, but not a combination. And are the entries, double check that the entries are correct and complete. This could include the titles of European standards or other standards, for example, or directives. And also double check that there are no duplicate references found in Clause 2. So whether a document is referred to, if it's normative, it belongs in Clause 2, informative and bibliography, but don't duplicate these references. It should be one or the other.
Okay, so you might meet some potential legal problems while you're drafting, and these generally fall under one of three categories. So you've either got copyright, you've got trademark, or you've got patents. It's quite a heavy topic, this, so we won't go into detail fully today, but it's just so that you are aware of what to do if you do meet any of these, because sometimes we do meet it and not everybody knows what to do. So for copyright information, a good starting point is Clause 32 of IR3, but you can also take a look at the Internal Regulations Part 1, Clauses 4.2 and 6.4, and again you can take a look at the CEN-CENELEC Guide 10, which I believe is available on the BOSS sites as well. That'll just give you a bit of information on what you need to do, any special information that you might need to know. Same thing with trademarks. If you have any trademarks in there, a good starting point is Clause 26.6 of the IR3. We ask that you try to avoid using any specific products within the standard, and if this is not possible, you can use a footnote. So we have an example on the screen right here where they've used multiplex real-time PCR method based on Tagman. Tagman is the specific product, and there's just a footnote underneath that just describes that it's a trademark of a certain company and that the information is given for the convenience of the user of the standard. It's not an endorsement by ISO or in this case CEN-CENELEC. And I believe there are 3 separate footnotes that you can use, and we recommend that you use the third one, the third example given in IR3. And then the final point is patents. So as I've already mentioned, if you have a patent, you need the introduction, it's obligatory. But again, you would remove the patent sentence in the foreword of publication. So this sentence that you can see, attention is drawn to the possibility that some of the elements of this document may be subject to patent rights. We will delete that. You do, however, need to make sure that you've registered your patent form. This can be found in the CEN-CENELEC Guide 8. It has to be completed and submitted as soon as possible by the TC, because if we don't have your form, we can't publish anything. It blocks the publication. So ideally get this done as soon as the inquiry, as soon as you know it's going to be there. A little point on cross-references, because we often find that drafters use auto-numbering and things like that. Cross-references can go fairly wrong fairly quickly. Goes without saying, make sure that all references in your text are correct. Sounds stupid, but make sure they actually exist. We do sometimes come across references to clauses that are not present in the text, and they're also not linked to any kind of external reference either. Make sure that references to tables, figures, and annexes are also correct. Your editor can check this as far as possible, but in some cases we don't know if it's referring to the correct place. So double check that. As I've already mentioned, don't use auto number or field codes where possible, or if you do use them, make sure you remove them before you send it to us, because when we process the text for XML, we can and have in the past actually completely lost references. That comes up with error bookmark not found or something like that, but it can make it impossible for us to get the references back, so do be aware of that. Make sure that any cross-references to external documents are correct. Although we do edit your text, we're not technical editors, so we don't really understand the technical content behind what you are preparing. So we rely quite heavily on you to make sure that these are correct. So now we move on to some general drafting tips to remember. So we talk first about Formulae, which is another big one for XML. We do meet quite a lot of problems with Formulae, and we ask that where possible you draft in math type. We know math type is a paid-for service, it's a paid-for software. If you have a number of formulae in your standard and you have a lot of standards that contain formulae, it's highly, highly valuable to download math type. We strongly recommend that you consider downloading it. It's worth it. It removes a number of problems for us when we create the XML, and it also ensures a very high quality. But if you're still not convinced, if maybe you only have 1 or 2 formulae in every 10 standards that you draft, you can still use the equation tool in Word and we will convert them into math type. However, just so that you're aware, this can result in a poorer quality of document and there is so much potential for problems. As I've already said, we're not technical experts, so these formulas can often be very confusing for us. We don't know what you're trying to really talk about. So yeah, be aware that if you don't use math type, we can get things wrong. In terms of laying them out, don't lay them out in tables, instead use a tab. When you lay them out in tables, we have to go through and systematically remove them. It causes problems with the XML massively, it just won't convert if they're in a table, so get rid of them. And pay close attention to correctness at inquiry and formal vote stage, because once we hit publication stage, if you notice that there's a problem, even if it's something really tiny, we can't actually change the formulae at publication stage. We'll discuss why later on, but make sure absolutely at inquiry and formal vote, where you can make as many technical changes as you want, that they are 100% correct. So onto publication issues. This is something that we've discussed quite a bit, and it's something that creates a lot of grey areas, but just for basic understanding's sake, what do we mean by a technical change? As a rule, it's something which changes the technical content of the standard, something that changes the scope or the parameter of a requirement, or something which adds or removes a requirement. A lot of grey area, a lot of scope for dispute with this, but we have 2 fairly good examples of when something is a technical change and when something isn't a technical change. So if you want to change, for example, shall by can or may or should, that is a technical change outright. It's the same vein. If we can prove that it's changing a requirement, then we will reject it. So why can't we make these changes? Well, first of all, the text is approved as it is by members as a whole when it's voted positively. So if we start to make these changes, it's a lot less transparent, the whole process, and that's not what we're aiming for. We need standardization to be nice and transparent. So if we start making changes to requirements at publication stage when everyone's agreed on it already, it's not very fair. But as well, we're not saying that you're wrong when we tell you something's technical, because as I've said several times, we're not technical experts, but these are the rules that we have to abide by. So now that's over, what changes can we make? We can make grammatical changes, that's not a problem. If something doesn't read right, we can change it. If something can be reworded a little better. We can correct things like font size, font formatting, if something's aligned a bit weird, indentation of things. We can make things bold, italic. that kind of thing is completely acceptable. The next point, no resubmissions of text. So we had a BT decision in 2018 where we basically agreed that there would be no more resubmissions at inquiry and formal vote stages. And this was applicable from the 30th of April 2018. And basically all it means is that the first delivery, so the draft that you send to CCMC, with your transmission notice, your figures and all of that kind of thing, you can't resubmit something again. Once you've submitted it, that's it. It's locked out for you. It also means, in terms of CCMC, the second delivery, so the draft that we send to translation after we've edited, at inquiry and formal vote stage, we can't prepare a resubmission to the translators. Once we've edited it, that's it, it's gone. So if you notice anything that needs to be changed, you need to liaise with us and we can see what we can do. However, at publication stage, we can prepare resubmissions to translators. It's absolutely fine. Obviously, you won't need to resubmit anything to us. However, you can expect a delay of 2 weeks of the DAB if a resubmission is requested. So just be aware of that. If you do find something that needs to be changed, add 2 weeks to your DAB. And then just a few final words. Pay attention to your draft. Again, it sounds very stupid, but just make sure that all of the necessary changes have been made as early as possible. Make sure everything is correct. If you're unsure about any aspect of the drafting procedure, get in touch with your editor. Our names are found on projects online. We're at your disposal for any questions you might have. And the TC does not need to be the one to contact us. We're happy to speak directly to working groups and drafters. We understand that often that's a bit of a better procedure to do because the TCs usually cover many different working groups and drafters. So if it's not possible for the TC to contact us, we can work with working groups and drafters directly. And it's free for you to have an editor at your meetings, and it can be very, very useful for you. We can join you via Skype, via GoToMeeting. We can come along in person if you're here in CCMC, it's much easier. We can also join via telephone, so anything is possible. And if you notice a drafting issue while your document is at inquiry or formal vote, even translation, let us know before we get to publication stage. Publication stage, our hands are completely tied, so earlier the better, really. And any editor can help you with anything, so you don't need to wait for your specific editor allocated to your draft. Contact Mail Production, get in touch, anyone can help you if you have any problems.